Good morning and welcome to the 2022 Ohioana Book Festival. I'm David Weaver, Executive Director of the Ohioana Library, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Coffee and Conversation with Wil Haygood. Hope you have your coffee. I've got mine. We're going to have a delightful hour-long conversation today with one of Ohio's most honored writers, historian and biographer and journalist, Wil Haygood, moderated by newly minted Dr. Dan Shellenbarger. Congratulations on his PhD in Arts Administration, Education, and Policy from The Ohio State University. So we're going to have a great time this morning. And first, I'd like to say a big thank you to our festival sponsors and partners, all of whom you can find listed on the Ohioana website. And thanks to our official bookseller, the Book Loft at German Village. You can get copies of all the books featured at the festival by going online to bookloft.com. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, the Ohio Channel Executive Director and creator and host of Book Notes, Dr. Dan Shellenbarger. Dan, take it away.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Wil, for joining us this morning. I was very lucky to have interviewed you a couple of years past on Book Notes, so I kind of have a past, but I want to make sure that our viewing audience out there kind of gets a little bit of some more knowledge. So I'm thinking about breaking these questions up into three categories. We're going to first talk about some biography. Then I want to talk a little bit about the writing process. And then finally, we're going to get into some of the books, including the most recent Colorization, which, as Wil has just told me, is going to be a 5-part documentary here coming up, which is going to add to Hulu's recent announcement of the Sammy Davis work that he did is also going to be coming out soon as a documentary. Now, we all know Wil. Wil is...
Sammy will be a miniseries.
A miniseries.
That's not a documentary. Yeah.
Very good. I stand corrected. It's very good to join Columbus's own Wil. Wil is he's a prolific writer. If you have looked at his books, he's had a number of them that have come out, in addition to being a Guggenheim and a National Endowment of the Humanities award recipient. So we're very lucky to have him here today and to be able to work with him to share his knowledge on how he gets all of this done. So Wil, from what I understand is that your grandmother played an important role in your upbringing when you were a young man right before you went into college.
Yes, very crucial. I lived with my grandmother from when I was born. And while my mother was in the house, it was my grandmother who seemed to teach me right from wrong, who seemed to watch out for me, to steer me, to set an example for me. She seemed to have a special, I mean, I'm sure she loved all of her grandkids equally, but she seemed to have an especially soft spot for me. I think she loved the fact that I liked books. And she came out of segregated Selma, Alabama, where she didn't always have access to books. And she saw that drive in me. And I know it made her smile when I brought good grades home. It also made my mother smile, but it especially made my grandmother very proud when I brought good grades home. I mean, she'd be the first person who I would show them to, because it also filled me with joy to see her smile about something that I had done.
So, one of the things, and we were talking earlier about this, is that the books, the biographies and the histories that you write, sometimes, and perfect example is Colorization. You were telling me about a book reviewer that had said, "Oh boy, here's another book on the history of film. This, I don't know what I'm going to think about this." And then the minute you open it, it's like, this is a story. And I feel the same thing with your other work, that there's something in there that compels the history to come alive, you give it heart. I'm wondering about, was there something in your upbringing that steered you toward to being aware of feelings and sensitivities that you can then incorporate that into your storytelling?
Yes, that's a great question too. I think that I've been witness to, in high school, junior high school, to this, I think, to this collective effort to marginalize Black heroes, Black heroines. It's all intertwined with the history of this country, of course. And so if you talk about Sammy Davis Jr., for instance, only in terms of the Rat Pack, he's been marginalized. You marginalize Sammy Davis Jr. when you just stick him into that tunnel like he's Frank Sinatra's shadow. But no, he came out of vaudeville. He never went to school. He integrated many nightclubs. He had to fight fiercely for his fame. He had a complicated relationship with his mother, who I tracked down, and I interviewed her. She was in her 90s. So it was just my effort to humanize these figures who had been marginalized in terms of history. And I think that the landscape is so rich and so unexplored when you talk about the people who I write about. For instance, when I started doing my Sammy Davis Jr. book, there was no major biography out about Sammy Davis Jr. In my Adam Clayton Powell book, when I started writing that, there was not yet a major biography about Sammy Davis Jr. The 1968, 1969 East High School basketball and baseball state championship teams. I kept waiting for somebody to write that book. If those hadn't been white athletes, I'm sure that book would have been written. I mean, that's a Friday Night Lights. That's a Hoosier story, all wrote into one, but nobody wrote it. And so I went to my editor in New York and I said, hey, there's an all-Black school in my hometown that won 2 state championships in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. 2, basketball and baseball, in the same year. No other high school in the country had done that. And my editor looked me dead in the eye and said, that's a book. And so I think I look at the landscapes, and when there's a lot of fertile ground there to be plowed, then I start digging. It's just like with the prize fighter, Sugar Ray Robinson. Yes, you can keep him in the tunnel fighting in the ring, but 3 of his best friends were Langston Hughes, Miles Davis, and Lena Horne. So that book becomes a 400-page narrative about Sugar Ray, Lena, Langston, and Miles. And when you put all 4 of them in Sugar Ray's nightclub, then it becomes a mighty rich story. And that's what I did.
I've often thought about one of the things that writers do is that they show light in the corner, so to speak. And we have seen, and boy, are we talking about this right now, about U.S. history, that in many cases, history is seen through somebody else's spotlight. We're only seeing bits and pieces.
Yeah.
And you're kind of turning on the floodlights. So we're starting to see some people that have been cast aside in history that are not gone. Well, they may be gone with us mortally, but they're not gone in memory. And you reignite their humanity. You reignite the person and show the important role that they play. Is that when you're searching for subject matter, are you looking for that, or do you come across something and say like, oh, this is a book? Like, how do you know what you're doing is going to be actually a book?
Yeah, I I think here is a good example. There had been books written about Thurgood Marshall. There had been books written about him. First Black Supreme Court Justice. And then when I started thinking about doing Showdown in the book about Thurgood Marshall, I zeroed in on his confirmation hearings. Now, his confirmation hearings took 8 weeks. All of the other justices in history, their confirmation hearings were 1 or 2 days. So why is the confirmation hearing for the first Black nominee, why does it stretch out the entire summer of 1967? And why was there no lead up to that announcement? Why did President Lyndon Johnson announce it out of the clear blue? Because he didn't want the forces that he knew were going to try to stop Thurgood Marshall. He didn't want them to have time to arm themselves. So these were Southern white men who did everything they could to stop Thurgood Marshall. There was no book that talked about the hearings of Thurgood Marshall. And so, I mean, and those that did mention it only mentioned it like a half a page or 1 or 2 pages. And then that told me, okay, that's a book. What happened during those 8 weeks, during that summer of 1967, when Thurgood Marshall had been nominated for the Supreme Court? I knew if I went to the Lyndon B. Johnson Library in Texas, I figured that I would be able to start to solve some of that riddle. And so I came across this letter, Dan, and it was great. It was a transcript of a phone call after LBJ had left office, and he had a late night phone call with Thurgood Marshall. He called him at his home and he said, "Thurgood, I got to tell you, getting you onto the Supreme Court caused me a lot of hell. It just caused me hell, Thurgood. And I'm now thinking about, I'm going to write a book about how difficult it was to get you onto that dang Supreme Court." And Thurgood Marshall said, "Well, Mr. President, if there's anything I can do to help you with the book process, please let me know." Months later, Lyndon Johnson died. And so I'm sitting there in the library and I find that letter and I said to myself, "Wil, the literary gods have tasked you with telling the story that LBJ wasn't able to tell. So you, Wil, must finish what LBJ, and the great civil rights president in our history, you must finish what he started. You must do this book." And so those are the nuggets, those are the clues in that tell me, okay, I'm on the right track.
That's awesome. So it's interesting. You have a sense of this story. So you went to Miami U, right here in Oxford, Ohio, and you graduated in urban planning. You didn't graduate in journalism or communications. You played basketball for a few years there.
1 year.
For a year, and then you found yourself out in you were working for Macy's. You had a number of jobs, but then you were out there. Now, it's a packed question. So I'm wondering if in college, if the kind of text writing attracted you then? Or like, why did it take a while for you to say, oh, I'm a writer and not, XYZ?
Yeah, I think I would write letters to whoever happened to be my sweetheart at the time. And, these are like, 3 and 4 page letters. And then I would come home and I would run into somebody and they would say, man, I ran into such and such. And she told me that she just got the loveliest letter from you. It was all about all kind of stuff going on in the world. And she said it was like a short story. And so that was the first time in life that I said, wow, if I can sit down at a desk and write something and put it in an envelope and mail it and have them still talking about it weeks later, then it must mean that I can convey in emotions and feelings and moods with the pen. And so I just started paying attention. And then this is very crucial. This is very crucial, Dan. After college, and I came back to Columbus, Ohio, and lived in the North End with my grandmother again. And there was a bookstore on High Street, Loan's bookstore. And right next to it was a more artsier bookstore called SBX. And I walked in the SBX bookstore one day and I saw a book. It's like a 450 page hardback book. And I always told myself, I'm going to buy one hardback book every payday for myself. And I got paid once every 2 weeks. So anyway, I'm in SBX bookstore and I see this book. It's called Letters, Langston Hughes, Arna Bontemps, 1925 to 1967, edited by Charles H. Nichols. I'll never forget it. I still have that book. And it was 2 writers who were African-American who wrote letters all through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. They never had jobs outside of writing, outside of arts, these 2. And these letters were about stage plays, about film scripts, about poems. And they were about the writing world, how hard it is to get a contract to write a book, but how you can be successful at doing it, about who they wanted their readers to be, about having a book published in England and Spain. And it was fascinating. I mean, it was the first time in life that I had seen a book where there were 2 Black artists who made their living solely with the written word. And it told me that, okay, it's possible. It's possible. It's possible to be a success in this field. I mean, and these letters, these letters mention everybody. They mention white film directors, white writers, and they mention Truman Capote, and they mention Marlon Brando and Ruby Dee and Eartha Kitt. It was just a smorgasbord of integrated history as they saw it unspooling, as they saw the years rolling out. And I don't believe there's any other book in my library that is as important to me as that book, because I wrote Charles Nichols at Brown University. I was 22 years old, and I wrote him a letter, a handwritten letter. And I just said, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I walked into a bookstore and I saw this book and I bought it. And I just want to say thank you for having the wherewithal to gather all of these letters from Arna Bontemps and Langston Hughes, because this book means so much to me. And about 2 weeks later, I get a letter back on Brown University stationery. And he says, "Dear Wil Haygood, thank you for your letter. You sound like somebody who we should encourage to come to Brown University for a master's degree in literature." And I kind of chuckled at that because I graduated with a 2.2. So I wasn't going to get into Brown University for no doggone master's degree. But it inspired me, just the fact that I found the book and I wrote him a letter and he wrote me back. It just seemed to validate the love that I had for letter writing, for writing period, and I said to myself, all right, how did Langston Hughes get into writing? He wrote for small newspapers. Okay, Wil, you got to get a job on a small newspaper. That's what you got to do. And then start growing from there. So that's what I did. I started out on small newspapers. And then I went to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and then I went to the Boston Globe, and then I went to the Washington Post. And so that was my arc. And, it came a time where I said to myself, I'm happier telling stories about the world and about in the country. And I want to put the wings back on these people who have had their wings clipped for various reasons. Thurgood Marshall or Sammy Davis Jr. or Adam Clayton Powell. I mean, these people had their wings clipped in mainstream newspapers. Mainstream newspapers never covered Sammy Davis the way they covered Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin. Why is that? Well, I had to dig deep and tell the country, why that happened. And so here's the real story that I can bring up, and I can put the wings back on Sammy Davis Jr.
It's so lovely to think about that. Part of your career was launched by writing love letters. And since that love extended then to the love you found in Langston Hughes's correspondence. So it's like this correspondence, we're texting and we're emailing, and it may be lighting the fires for some of us to just continue on. I wanted you to recount the one story that your Macy's supervisor basically advised you out of a job, and I just wanted you to tell that story because I found it so interesting and kind of a good sort of weird advice.
Yeah, she was the store manager, and this was at the Queens Macy's, and I was a low-level floor manager in the sheets and towels department. I had went through the vaunted executive training program at Macy's. And about a year in, I don't know, maybe it was a year and a few months, Janet Moran called me to her office. And she said, Wil, look, this is not working out. And I said, well, it's not working out. And she said, yeah, the sales aren't strong enough over there. And oftentimes I can't find you on the floor. I would be back in the stockroom reading books. And so she said, Wil, here's a notebook. Here's a notebook, Wil, and I want you to take it home and write what it is you really want to do in life. And I said, why do you want me to do that? She said, because you won't have this job much longer. I'm going to have to let you go. She said, but we're all very fond of you, but you're just not ruthless enough to make it in retelling. This is a hard field, you know, and it's just, you just aren't cut out for this. And so take this notebook home and write down what you want to really do in life. And I said, I know what I want to do. I want to beat the sales figures next week at Lord & Taylor and at Bloomingdale's and at Saks Fifth Avenue. That's what I want to do. And she said, no, you don't. No, you don't. And so I went home that night crushed, knowing that I was being fired. And she asked me, I mean, and I didn't know what to write. And so I just opened a notebook and started writing about my hometown, about missing my grandmother, about missing family members, about missing friends, and about the winters there. I mean, it was just a stream of consciousness riffing about my upbringing, sort of, in my landscape. And I took it to her the next morning and I said, and I'm sorry, I just couldn't think straight because I'm so worried about my efforts to save my job. And so this is all I could write. And it's just nothing. And she opens the notebook and starts reading, and total silence. And she flips the pages. It was about 7 pages of riffing, 8 pages. And she's still reading. And she looks up at me and she closes the notebook and she says, Wil Haygood, whatever you do in life, you have to go and become a writer. And I said, excuse me? She said, this is so touching. It's so beautiful. I did not know that you had this skill inside of you. She said, trust me, please, whatever you do in life, Wil, you have to go and become a writer. It truly gives me goosebumps to this day, because I mean, if she hadn't have said that, I think I would have been fired from Macy's and probably would have went over to Saks Fifth Avenue to try to get a job at another department store. And my life would have been, you know, in that orbit. But when she said that, I went over to the New York Public Library and I was reading the New York Times. And there was a story in there about Ned Chilton, who was the publisher of a newspaper in Charleston, West Virginia, who had just gotten an award because he stood up to the KKK after he hired the first Black reporter at that paper in 1975, the first Black at the Charleston Gazette. And I just said, wow, now this is drama. This is the kind of publisher I love to work for. So I wrote him a letter and I told him, I said, I've been fired at Macy's department store, but I want to become a writer. And I'm leaving, New York City in 2 weeks. So if you would dare to give me an opportunity to work on your newspaper, please send the letter to my grandmother's house, 1343 North 5th Street in Columbus, Ohio. So 3 weeks later, I walk up back home in Columbus, here in Columbus, and there is a letter waiting on me from the Charleston Gazette newspaper from Ned Chilton. And he says, I received your letter. You don't have enough experience to start out here as a full-time writer, but I'm interested in meeting you, and perhaps there's a position as a copy editor here. Please call Don Marsh, who is the editor of the newspaper, and let him know if you can schedule a trip to come here and meet with us. And I immediately called Don Marsh and told him, hey, I'll be in Charleston next week, and I would love to meet you. And so I went to Charleston, West Virginia, and I took the copy editing test. This is a good story for students out there. I took the copy editing test, did good, and I was a copy editor, editing other people's stories. But I knew in my heart and soul I wanted to write. So on my 2 days off, which were Wednesday and Thursdays, I would go around the city and find a story to write. Then I went to Terry Wimmer, the city editor. He lives in LA now. And I said, and I would say, Terry, if I write a story, can you get it in the newspaper? And he said, yes, if it is good enough. I can't pay you, however. I said, oh, I don't care about that. I just needed clips so I could send off to some other editor so I could get hired. And so at the end of the year, I had like 55 stories that I had written for the newspaper and that had gotten into the newspaper, stories that I had written on my days off. So I sent some of the clips to John Craig and at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He asked me to come in for an interview. I get in there and there are 3 people in the office. This was in 1983. There were 3 people in the office, and he said, Wil, the first thing I want to ask you is, you work as a copy editor 8 hours a day. How did you find the time to write all of these stories? And I said, well, sir, on my days off, I would simply commit myself to finding a story in town, story about an arts festival, or story about a singer, or a story about a hotel that's shutting down. And I would simply write these feature stories. And then the 2 other men who were sitting there rose up out of their seats and walked out of the office. And he later told me, he said, they knew once you said that, they knew that we had to hire you. And so, and then I went to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and then my career started to roll out. Then I went to the Boston Globe and the Washington Post.
This is such an amazing story. If you ever write your autobiography or somebody is your biography, the title should be Wil Haygood, Life Led Through Letters, Life Made Through Letters, or something like that. But what you bring up, and it's interesting because I've been reading all of these articles right now about how, like, people interested in creative fields, that you need to get something practical. You need to, it's great if you want to do that on the side. And one of the things that you prove is like, yeah, I mean, if you wake up one day and say, I want to be a writer, that just doesn't happen overnight. You need to work at it. But if you have the tenacity and the kind of drive, why not keep on pursuing our own desires to become a writer? And you've proved that. I read a statistic that 81% of Americans feel like they have a book in them. That's like 200 million, I think. I can't do the math that quickly off the top of my head. Yeah. But how many of those people are spending their days off, writing those chapters or looking for those stories? And this is what happens when you have something. So you obviously had something inside of you that said, I got to do this. I don't care if I'm not getting paid for this. I'm making a living. I can pay my rent. But something inside of you said, I just got to do that. Do you know why? Was it just the supervisor, or was it those love letters? You thought, well, I can write a whole bunch of love letters and have a whole bunch of fans. Like, what was that kept that fire burning?
Yeah, I would walk I would walk into bookstores and I would look around and I would say, how come there's not a book about Sammy Davis Jr.? How come there's not a book about Black film as it relates to the rest of the country? Not just a book about Black film staying in the Black film lane, but a book that opens up onto the country as it relates to the struggle of Black actors, actresses, screenwriters. And it's a good lesson here, Dan. I went down the Mississippi River, and that became my first book. It was sort
Two
of
on the River, 1986.
Yeah, it's called Two on the River. And then Peter Davison, the editor of that book, called me to his office in Boston and said, okay, and you've written this book. You've shown me that you have talent to write books. So what do you want to do next? And I was so awed that he thought that I could continue to write books. I was like, whoa, this is somebody who was saying to me that you are going to be an author. This is just not a fluke, this one book about this trip down the Mississippi River. And he said, so what do you want to do next? And I said, well, I owe someone a debt. Literally, that's what I said. I said, I owe someone a debt. He said, who is that? I said, I was in the Upward Bound program in my hometown of Columbus, Ohio. And I later read that one of the thinkers who helped create the Upward Bound program was the Harlem Congressman, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And I said, Upward Bound really changed my life. And I said, so I've been carrying this little headline about him and his death in my wallet. In Charleston, West Virginia, I saw an article about him. This is the 10th anniversary of the death of Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who had been kicked out of Congress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He died in scandal. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying to my editor, he wasn't scandalous for me. He was a lifesaver. And so I, Peter, want to examine his life, and I'd like to write a book about this man. And my editor got up from his desk, came around to where I was sitting, bent down and said, nobody, Wil, talks about Adam Clayton Powell Jr. anymore. And my heart sank because I just knew he was going to say, that's not a book that we at Houghton Mifflin need to do. But he rose up and said, and that's why you're going to do the book. That's why you're going to do the book. Nobody talks about him anymore. And, that line of thinking opened up a whole canyon for me as it relates to my other books. Nobody was talking about East High School's championship teams from 1968, 69. There wasn't even a marker in the city about them. Now there is because of my book, thankfully. And I thank Mayor Ginther for doing that. Now there is a marker on the side of the school. But nobody was talking about Sammy Davis Jr. Nobody was talking about Sugar Ray Robinson. These people get overshadowed and sort of forgotten. So that's another clue to why I should get into the skull of the story, get into the skull of the stories that I've written about. And so that's, that's been part of my methodology.
That's wonderful. Of course, Adam Clayton Powell became King of Cats.
Yeah.
And the East High School was Tigerland. And
Yep.
I just think about actually one of the things we do at the Ohio channel is we cover the historical markers. So we do these, few minute things, but, and this is going back to this idea of giving it heart. Like a marker is great. We need to know this. This needs to be in our collective memories.
Right.
But a book gives it life. A book gives the story, and the story is what lingers far after the markers are going to fall over or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's the story that lingers within us. So
Yep.
I wanted to ask, and we do have a few questions I see from some of the viewers. And if you go on the Q&A, I'm going to try to. I don't want to hog all the time with Wil. It's hard not to give up the mic, but I do. I know Dante Wood Spikes has something here. We're going to get to that in a minute. But I wanted to talk about how so you're writing about parts of history that have been overlooked. You're writing about people that haven't had the searchlight shown directly on them, and you're telling these wonderful stories. So you're bringing us part of American history, and I would even say that you're writing about people, but you're also writing about this country.
Yeah.
And all of your works, it has a historic kind of framing, a historic lexicon that goes with that. Now, these are important people. These are passionate people that you talk about. When you're writing, how do you know? With these stories, how do you know if what you're writing is good? Like, what is that internal thing inside of you that says, I'm going to continue to keep on typing through this versus like, maybe this isn't going to go anywhere?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to have faith in, in knowing how something might turn out. I mean, you just don't know. But when I was in the basement of this man who was a White House butler, and he had worked for 8 US presidents, and he had never been written about, and he had a basement that was full of like all sorts of artifacts, pictures of him and Harry Truman, him and Dwight Eisenhower, him and Richard Nixon, these framed letters. Go back to letters. He had these framed letters. Whenever I see letters written to somebody, something goes off in my head, it just does. He had worked 35 years at the White House. And nobody had told his story. I said, okay, this is a story. And if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to write this story. And so about these other figures, Dan, and that is a really good question. I have enough confidence in my writing style that I know that even if you think you know who Sammy Davis Jr. is, then I'm going to pull you in there with my writing chops and with the fact that I went around the country and I interviewed people who knew Thurgood Marshall, who knew Sugar Ray Robinson, who knew Lyndon Johnson, who knew Eartha Kitt, et cetera. So I use my newspaper skills to really go interview people, to really bring added life in addition to my writing skills, to bring the story up out of the shadows. I'm in my study working on this book about film, my new book that's out now. And yeah, working on colorization. And then Charlottesville happens. There's a uprising in Charlottesville, Virginia, with Nazi flags and with KKK emblems and with racist bigots walking and murdering the young lady from, she was from the area, and she was run down and murdered by someone. It was just tragic. So I was in 2017, and then Trump gets in the office, and there's this big rise in hate crimes Then there's the 2015 Oscar So White movement. And then there's these monuments and these Southern monuments that have been emotionally terrorizing Black students all over this country. And then I knew I was on the right track with this book. I just knew it. I mean, you know, there is a reckoning coming down off of the movie screen at street level. And, you know, so I'm writing about one of the most popular movies at the time, the most popular movie at the time, in 1915, called The Birth of a Nation, all about in the Ku Klux Klan who were portrayed as heroes. 1 out of 4 people saw that movie in 1915. And it harmed so many Black people in this country. It played in all of the major cities. Folks who protested, Black and white people who protested, were thrown in jail. And there were lawsuits. It was just awful. But that's how cinema started. And so cinema started as being an enemy to Black people. And so there are many heroes in this book. There are many Black heroes and many white heroes, men and women. But when you try to hide that story, then you do a great disservice to the history of this country. When you try to hide what happened from 1915, you know, in the next 100 years. So it is a book about tyranny. It's a book about heartache. It's a book about triumph. It's a book about masterpieces written for the screen. It's a book about, you know, and that tells you why 2 of the biggest Black stars, Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, had to be at the March on Washington. Even when many of their friends, white friends, told them it's going to be dangerous to go to the March on Washington. And the FBI is going to be watching you, and people might not go see your movies next week if you're there with this radical Martin Luther King Jr. But they were there. Why were they there? How did they get there? Who did they take with them? Marlon Brando, and there was Burt Lancaster, and there was Tony Francioso. I mean, there were people who were there with them, you know, and that's just great drama. I mean, look, my books are about storytelling, you know, and if I find a great story, you know, come hell or high water, I'm, you know, as long as I can do it, and I'm going to write that story in book form.
That's absolutely wonderful. And it's a good segue. You talked about The Butler, which also got made into a movie.
Yeah.
But, you know, one of the things, and I am going to go right now. So we've got about 9 minutes here, and I want to get the 2 questions. But I did want to bring up the colorization actually starts out with D.W. Griffith in Birth of a Nation. And one of the things I went through film and video school, and there's such adulation for D.W. Griffith is coming up with film language. And so it's always brought to us as that. It's like, you know, this is a man who created the modern film for as we know it, although like so many originators, he actually was not alone in this. There were a number of other people. Right. And there's sometimes a side note that says, oh, also he was responsible for bringing back the Klan. A lot of the monuments actually happened in response to that. Whereas, so we can have a whole nother conversation of like, how do you separate the art from the person? Looking at Birth of the Nation and just absolutely how racist that movie is and how contradictory of actual history it is right. Very disturbing. And so it's hard for me to then look at like, oh, he had the film cuts, he had parallel editing, and he did that stuff. And a lot of the times we skip over like what else the other parts of this. And I think that's that's through all of your writing. It kind of shows us. And that's why I very much believe that, and others have said this, that you are writing about American history. So Dante Wood Spikes asks, my question to you is, what is your biggest life lesson from the stories you've written? And I want to make sure that we have enough time for 2 other questions there, Wil. Your biggest life lessons from the stories that you've written.
Okay. Once I was sent on a story assignment, and I was at the Boston Globe. And the editor told me I had to go to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst to write a story about a visiting writer who was there. And I asked the editor, oh, all right, who's the writer? And she said, James Baldwin. And James Baldwin, I mean, I was just astounded that I was going to have the opportunity to sit face to face with James Baldwin. So anyway, and I arrived at the house up there where he's staying, and then the couple who he was staying with, they were leaving, and they told me to go on in, Wil. He'll be right down. He's upstairs, and he came flitting down the steps. He's a very jazzy figure. He was smoking a cigarette. He said, hey, baby, how you doing? And I said, oh, I'm doing fine, Mr. Baldwin. What an honor to meet you, et cetera, et cetera. And after the interview, I had silently said to myself, oh, I think I'm going to ask him something personal before I leave this house. Now, at this time, I had not written one book. And I said, I'd like to ask you something personal, Mr. Baldwin. And he said, sure, baby, shoot. And I said, do you think that I will be able to write books someday? And he looked at me and he said, how the hell should I know that? I don't know who you are. And I don't know what kind of drive you have, baby. Books are hard, man. Books are hard to write. Why you want to ask me that question? I have no idea who you are. And my heart sank and my head dropped, and he saw, I think, how hurt I was. And because he paused, a long pause, and then he leaned into me and he said, but baby, I'll tell you this. Whatever you do in life, you must go the way your blood beats. Whatever you do. And those words are on the wall of my writing study to this day. Whatever you do in life, you must go the way your blood beats. I wanted to write books. I had to take leaves of absence from newspapers, to be off to write the book. And I can't tell you how many friends would say to me, Wil, who knows if your job will still be here at the newspaper when you are finished on this trek of research for this book. Aren't you afraid? And I would say, nope, I just have to write this book. If my job is here, great. If it's not, then I'll make it somehow. I mean, and so that's been an important lesson for me, things that I wanted to do. If my blood has been flowing in that direction, then that's what I set out to do.
That's awesome. We have 4 minutes, and I'm going to cram in 2 questions. Although I think you just answered a little bit of the second question. This is from Cindy Puckett. What words of wisdom do you have for young writers and what they should be reading? And I'm going to throw in Betty Weibel's question there too. What do you do about writer's block when you're stuck? So if you could name some books that you would say that are inspirational, and then is there any in 3 minutes, how do you get unstuck when you got writer's block?
Yeah, I mean, I humbly say I have never had writer's block. I think that happens more, with fiction writers who have to make up things. I mean, nonfiction writers, a nonfiction writer has a map, and that map has been organized by facts. Okay, follow the facts, Will. Okay, what was Thurgood Marshall doing in May of 1959? Where was he at? Maybe there's a clue in that town. And so and then you have to marshal the facts, and they can lead you out of any stumbling blocks that you might have as a writer. So I don't have the talent to write fiction, novels. Now some people have told me, oh, Will, if you put your mind to it, oh, I'm sure that you could write a novel. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are some novels that I read that are so good that I say, oh man, I can't touch that kind of talent. And I mean, that's like, big time, major talent, and so, I tend to do what makes me happy, and focusing on telling these nonfiction stories, make me happy.
That's so wonderful. Thank you very much. I just saw in the chat, somebody said that Will just gave us a masterclass in writing, and indeed you have. Thank you so much for sharing your background and your wisdom. I wish you continued success here on Hulu. There's some upcoming projects that you have that are going to be very exciting. I'm a dedicated fan, so I will look forward to your reading. And I definitely think I need to start writing letters to my wife. So maybe that will also help me eventually become a writer one day like you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much.
Back to you, David.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, so amazing. What an amazing hour. I just want to say, I can't say thank you enough to Dr. Dan Shellenbarger, our moderator, and especially our wonderful guest, Wil Haygood. And Will, we're just looking forward to all of the new projects coming down the line. The Sammy Davis miniseries on Hulu, and then the documentary about colorization. And I want to say a very special thank you also to that store manager at Macy's.
Yes.
Retail's loss was literature's gain, and we're very grateful.
Thank you.
So thanks everyone for coming. Reminder, you can get copies of Will's book and books by all of our festival authors from the Book Loft of German Village at bookloft.com. Thanks again to all of our festival sponsors and partners. And thank you for joining us. Check out the Ohioana website for all of the festival programming on our final day. Thank you all. Have a great Sunday. Thank you again. Safe travels back to DC, Will. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.